The first thing that hit the floor was a splash of premium artesian water. It didn't just spill. It was poured deliberately onto the sterile hospital tile by a woman who had spent her entire life believing that some people were simply born to be stepped over. The water spread across the floor like a transparent glass stain, seeping toward the hem of a pair of dark, practical trousers. Then the empty plastic cup followed, clattering against the ground with a hollow, cheap sound. By the time Cassandra Whitmore Hale turned her back to walk away, the quiet corner of the VIP surgical wing felt cold, thick with the kind of dismissal that leaves a mark long after the floor is dry. And through all of it, the woman on the floor said nothing. She remained seated, one hand reaching toward the fallen cup, her face angled downward in display of fatigue and quiet humiliation. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. Her silence was a heavy, reflective thing that Cassandra ignored with the practiced ease of a woman who never looked at the help long enough to see their eyes. Cassandra Whitmore Hale was 42 years old and moved through the world as if it were a private club where she held the only master key. She didn't just have wealth. She had a pedigree that went back generations, the kind that replaced empathy with efficiency. People called her formidable. Her social circle called her discerning. Nobody called her compassionate. And as she checked her diamond-encrusted watch, she didn't feel a flicker of guilt about the thirsty woman she'd just humiliated. Her only concern was the 1-in-a-million surgery her son, Kenneth, was scheduled for in less than an hour, a procedure that required the world's most elite specialist. Cassandra Whitmore Hale didn't just walk into a room. She claimed it. As she paced the length of the hospital's private surgical wing, the rhythmic click of her designer heels against the polished marble sounded like the ticking of a very expensive, very impatient clock. To Cassandra, the world was a series of managed expectations and curated surfaces. Her life was built on the Whitmore standard, a generational philosophy that equated refined aesthetics with intrinsic value. She was a woman who believed that the quality of one's character could be discerned by the thread count of their linens or the sharpness of their silhouette. Her husband, a man of similar pedigree, often joked that Cassandra possessed a social compass that automatically pointed away from anything unpolished. She didn't view this as a flaw, but as a necessary filter for a woman of her standing. In her world, the formidable and the discerning were the only ones who truly moved the needle of history. The rest were merely background noise, the invisible hands that served the champagne, the silent workers who maintained the hedges of her estate, and the nameless faces in the hospital corridors who existed only to be navigated around. Today, however, the background noise was deafening. Her 6-year-old son, Kenneth, lay behind double doors, his life suspended by a medical crisis that no amount of Whitmore influence could simply wish away. The 1-in-a-million surgery he required was the only thing she couldn't buy off a shelf, though she had spent the morning on the phone ensuring that the specialist being flown in was nothing less than the absolute best in the field. Despite the gnawing terror in her chest, Cassandra's posture remained perfect. She adjusted the cuff of her silk blouse, her diamond-encrusted watch catching the sterile overhead light. To show fear was to show weakness, and a Whitmore was never weak. She looked down the long, empty hallway, her gaze skipping over the heavy-built woman sitting on the floor near the waiting area. To Cassandra, the woman in the plain beige shirt was an eyesore, a smudge on the otherwise clinical perfection of the VIP wing. She was naturally superior, a belief so deeply ingrained that she didn't even realize she was holding her breath to avoid breathing the same air as someone so unrefined. She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a bottle of premium artesian water, the plastic cool against her palm. She didn't see a human being in distress. She saw a beggar and a nuisance who didn't belong in this sanctuary of wealth. In Cassandra's mind, people were either assets or obstacles, and as she prepared to take a sip, she had already decided which one the woman on the floor was. She was the obstacle, the contamination that dared to disrupt the Whitmore standard at its most vulnerable moment. The world was a private club, and Cassandra was about to remind this stranger exactly who held the key. Dr. Zarina Madikol felt the weight of the last 36 hours pressing down on her shoulders like a leaden cloak. In the world of pediatric neurosurgery, time did not move in linear hours. It moved in heartbeats, monitor pings, and the steady, agonizing precision of a microdissector. She had just stepped out on emergency stabilization for a neonate 3 floors down, a marathon session that had followed a full day of rounds and a previous 6-hour trauma case. Her scrub top was damp with the sweat of intense concentration, and her hands, usually the steadiest instruments in the building, had begun to develop a microscopic tremor that only she could detect. It was a signal of a body reaching its absolute limit. She had found a quiet corner in the VIP wing, away from the frantic energy of the main nurse's station, and sank onto the floor. The marble was cold, a welcome shock against her skin, but the dizziness wouldn't subside. Her throat felt as though it had been lined with sandpaper. In the rush to save a life 3 floors down, she had bypassed her last 3 scheduled breaks, and now the dehydration was manifesting as a rhythmic thumping behind her eyes. She knew she had less than 40 minutes before she had to scrub in for the Hale surgery, the most complex pediatric case the hospital had seen in a decade. Kenneth Hale's brain was a labyrinth of tangled vessels, and she was the only one with the map. Zareen leaned her head back against the wall, closing her eyes for a second that felt like an eternity. She just needed a moment of stillness, a single sip of water to steady the vertigo before she took the boy's life into her hands. When she heard the sharp, rhythmic click of heels approaching, she didn't look up at first. She simply reached out a hand, her voice a dry rasp that barely carried through the air. She saw the flash of a premium water bottle in the hand of the woman pacing nearby, a woman who radiated the scent of expensive perfume and the cold energy of someone who had never known a day of physical exhaustion. "Please," Zareen whispered, her fingers grazing the air toward the bottle. "Just a sip. I'm a bit faint." She didn't see a face. She only saw the sharp crease of tailored trousers and the slight recoil of the woman, as if Zareen were a stray animal blocking her path. The silence that followed was more dehydrating than the thirst itself. Zareen watched, through a haze of fatigue, as the woman deliberately tilted the bottle. She didn't hand it over. Instead, she let the water stream out, splashing onto the floor just inches from Zareen's reaching hand. The clink of the empty plastic cup hitting the tile sounded like a gavel. Zareen looked down at the spilled liquid, soaking into the grout. She didn't feel anger. She was too tired for anger. She only felt a profound, quiet disappointment. She was the one who was about to go into a room and fight for every second of that woman's son's future. Yet here, in the hallway, she wasn't even worth a cup of water. She remained composed, her lips gently closed, watching the woman walk away toward the light of the windows. Zareen reached for her bag, her fingers brushing the hospital ID card that sat face down against the leather, the name Dr. Cole hidden from the world, and prepared herself to stand up. She had a life to save, even if the world thought she was invisible. Kenneth was the only part of Cassandra's world that she couldn't control with a signature or a phone call. At 6 years old, he was a child of light and endless curiosity, possessing a laugh that could pierce through the thickest layers of Whitmore stoicism. But for the last 3 months, that light had been dimming. What began as a slight stumble in his stride had spiraled into a nightmare of blurred vision and agonizing headaches. The diagnosis was a word that sounded like a death sentence, a rare, deep-seated arteriovenous malformation in the brainstem, a tangled nest of vessels so fragile that a single misstep in surgery would mean permanent paralysis or worse. Cassandra had spent millions in a frantic, global search for a cure. She had summoned the most decorated surgeons from London, Tokyo, and Johns Hopkins to her estate, only to be met with the same sympathetic head shakes and talk of palliative care. In her world, problems were solved by escalating them to the highest bidder. But for the first time, her wealth was shouting into a void. To the medical establishment, Kenneth was a tragic statistic, a high-risk casualty that no one was willing to touch. Then they found a name that whispered to the halls of elite medicine like a myth. The specialist. Dr. Zarina Madiko didn't have the flashy social media presence or the penthouse office of the surgeons Cassandra usually employed. She was a woman of ghosts and miracles, known for taking the cases that everyone else had abandoned. The hospital board had spoken to her with a hushed reverence that Cassandra initially mistook for exaggeration. If Dr. Cole cannot navigate that labyrinth, the chief of medicine had told her, then no one on this earth can. For Cassandra, Dr. Cole had become a divine figure in her mind, an abstract savior who was being flown in on a private jet specifically to save the Whitmore legacy. She imagined a woman who looked like her, sharp, impeccably dressed, and radiating the kind of high-status authority that Cassandra respected. She had spent the morning obsessing over the details of the surgical suite, demanding the air filtration be checked and the lighting be adjusted to perfection for the arrival of this medical titan. She looked at Kenneth through the glass of the observation room, his small frame looking even tinier amidst a forest of tubes and monitors. He was her golden son, the heir to a fortune and a name that spanned centuries, yet here he was, reduced to a fragile pulse on a screen. Cassandra's hand tightened around her designer bag, the knuckles white. She was ready to offer anything. Half her estate, a wing in the hospital named in Dr. Cole's honor. If only the woman would arrive and perform a miracle she had promised. She remained oblivious of the fact that the miracle worker was currently sitting just 50 feet away on the cold floor, staring at a puddle of spilled water and a tipped plastic cup, waiting for her heart rate to settle before she was called to save the boy who meant everything. The silence of the VIP wing was suddenly shattered by the synchronized movement of heavy doors and the urgent murmur of a medical team in motion. Cassandra stood tall, smoothing her silk trousers and preparing her most gracious, high-status smile. The chief of medicine, accompanied by 2 senior residents, marched down the corridor with a purposeful stride. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the arrival of the legend, the woman who would justify the Whitmore name's refusal to accept defeat. "She's here," the chief whispered, his tone more reverent than Cassandra had ever heard it. Cassandra turned toward the light, expecting a figure of sharp angles and tailored authority to step through the glass doors. Instead, her breath hitched. From the shadows of the waiting area, the woman in the beige shirt stood up. She moved slowly, her full, heavy build a stark contrast to the lean, frantic energy of the residents surrounding her. To Cassandra's horror, the team didn't walk past the woman she had just humiliated. They converged upon her. A nurse stepped forward, holding out a dark blue surgical scrub jacket with practiced grace. The woman reached out, the same hand that had reached for the spilled water just minutes ago, and slid into the garment. One of the residents stepped in to hand her a high-end stethoscope, which she draped around her neck with familiarity that spoke of 1,000 saved lives. "Dr. Cole," the chief of medicine said, bowing his head slightly. "The patient is prepped. We were worried about the delay." "I needed a moment to center myself," Zareen replied. Her voice was no longer a dry rasp. It was a low, resonant bell that commanded the entire hallway. She didn't look at Cassandra immediately. She took a surgical mask from a tray, her dark hair pulled loosely back into its practical bun, and adjusted it with steady fingers. The world seemed to tilt beneath Cassandra's designer heels. The obese woman she had deemed a contamination, the beggar she had denied a simple sip of water, was a very specialist she had spent millions to find. The realization hit her like a physical blow, more violent than the sound of the plastic cup hitting the tile. She watched as a nurse handed Dr. Cole a digital tablet containing Kenneth's latest scans. Finally, Zareen turned. Her eyes were lowered for a moment as she adjusted her mask, and then she looked directly at Cassandra. There was no rage in her gaze, no petty triumph. There was only a cold, clinical recognition that was far more terrifying. She looked at Cassandra's diamond watch, then at the designer bag, and finally at the spot on the floor where the water was still drying to the grout. In that look, Cassandra felt her entire social hierarchy crumble. She was no longer the benefactor or the formidable mother. She was simply the woman who had poured water on the floor in front of the only person who could save her son. The Whitmore standard had met a standard it couldn't comprehend. And as the surgical team began to lead Dr. Cole toward the double doors, Cassandra realized with a sickening jolt that she was now the one who was truly invisible. The double doors of the surgical theater hummed as they swung open, releasing a draft of air that felt 10 degrees colder than the hallway. Dr. Cole stood at the threshold, the blue surgical mask now concealing the lower half of her face, leaving only her eyes visible. They were the eyes of a woman who had seen the inside of 1,000 tragedies and navigated her way out of nearly all of them. As the residents and nurses bustled past her with trays of stainless steel instruments, a heavy, expectant silence settled between the surgeon and the mother. Cassandra felt a desperate urge to speak, to offer a frantic apology or a promise of endless gratitude. But the words died in her throat. The Whitmore standard had no protocol for this level of shame. She looked at Dr. Cole, really looked at her, and saw not the full, heavy build she had mocked, but the immense, grounded presence of a protector. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted. It had been utterly annihilated. In the hierarchy of this building, Cassandra's millions couldn't buy a single milliliter of the oxygen Dr. Cole breathed. Here, the woman in the beige shirt was the law, the light, and the only bridge between Kenneth and a future. Dr. Cole didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She simply looked Cassandra in the eye, her gaze steady and unblinking. It was a look that acknowledged everything. The spilled water, the designer heel stepping over her hand, the cold elitism, and then deliberately set it aside. It wasn't forgiveness. It was professionalism. It was a silent declaration that she was a better woman than the one standing before her. She was going into that room to save a child not because of who his mother was, but because of who she was. The moment stretched, a fragile cord tension that finally snapped when Dr. Cole gave a single, microscopic nod. It was a gesture of transition, the moment the stranger became the surgeon. She turned away, her practical, low bun disappearing behind the closing doors. As the seals engaged with pressurized hiss, Cassandra was left alone in the corridor. She looked down at her hands and saw they were shaking. For the first time in her life, she felt the true weight of her own insignificance. She sank into one of the sterile plastic chairs, staring at the spot where the water had finally dried, leaving nothing behind but a faint, mocking outline of her own cruelty. The silence that followed the closing of the surgical doors was not peaceful. It was heavy, medicinal, and absolute. Cassandra sat alone in the center of the VIP waiting lounge, a space designed for comfort that now felt like a gilded cage. The plush velvet armchairs and the soft, ambient lighting did nothing to settle the cold dread pooling in her stomach. Her gaze, usually fixed on the horizon of her next great acquisition, was now trapped by a small, mundane object resting on the floor a few feet away. The empty plastic water bottle. It lay on its side, a hollow skeleton of her own arrogance. Beside it, the tile was still slightly damp, a ghost of the liquid she had poured out with such calculated disdain. Every time she closed her eyes, she didn't see the flickering monitors or the sterile white halls. She saw the quiet defeat in the eyes of the woman she had treated like a beggar. She remembered the way she had stepped over Dr. Cole's hand, the way she had used her social superiority as a weapon against a human being who was simply exhausted from saving lives. The irony was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. She had spent a fortune to secure the finest hands in the world to reach into the delicate clockwork of her son's brain, only to realize she had spent her morning trying to break those very hands. She thought of Kenneth, his golden hair, his small, trusting face, and then she thought of Dr. Cole. The surgeon was currently hovering over him, navigating the one-in-a-million labyrinth of vessels, where a single millimeter of error was the difference between a future and a tragedy. Cassandra's diamond watch ticked loudly in the void. Each second was a reminder that her son's heartbeat was now tethered to the steady pulse of a woman she had deemed unrefined. Her wealth, her pedigree, and the Whitmore standard were useless here. They couldn't scrub in. They couldn't steady a scalpel. They couldn't pray. She realized, with a sickening clarity, that she had spat on the only person in the universe who held the power to bring her son back to her. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and picked up the discarded bottle. It felt light, insignificant, much like she felt now. She clutched it against her silk blouse, the plastic crinkling in the silence. For the first time in 42 years, Cassandra Whitmore Hale wasn't waiting for a subordinate or a business partner. She was waiting for mercy. She was waiting to see if a woman she had treated with utter lack of compassion would return that cruelty with the life of her child, or Dr. Cole possessed a grace that Cassandra herself had never known existed. The hours stretched, agonizing and hollow, as she sat in the wreckage of her own pride, staring at the doors that refused to open. The heavy double doors of the surgical suite finally hissed open, releasing the sharp, ozone scent of a sterile environment. Dr. Cole emerged alone. She had removed her surgical cap, and her dark hair remained pulled back in that same practical low bun, though a few exhausted strands now brushed against her temples. Her face was weary, the lines of fatigue deeper than they had been an hour ago, yet her presence was as steady and unyielding as a mountain. Cassandra bolted upright, the empty water bottle crinkling loudly in her hand, a sharp, plastic reminder of her shame. She searched Dr. Cole's face for any sign of a grudge, any flicker of the petty satisfaction she herself would have felt in this position. Instead, she found a clinical, devastatingly polite wall of professional courtesy. "The surgery was successful," Dr. Cole began, her voice calm and resonant, carrying no trace of the dry rasp from the hallway. "The arteriovenous malformation has been fully embolized. We encountered a minor hemorrhage near the brainstem, but we were able to secure the vessel without any neurological deficit. Kenneth is currently in the recovery bay. His vitals are stable, and the initial reflex tests are promising." She spoke with a terrifyingly precise eloquence, laying out the complex medical data, as if she were presenting to a board of directors rather than a mother on the brink of collapse. There was no warmth in her tone, but there was no malice either. It was a professional's grace, a level of conduct so far above Cassandra's earlier behavior that it felt like a physical weight. Dr. Cole treated her with exactly the kind of respect that Cassandra had failed to show her, and that kindness felt like a burn against Cassandra's skin. "He will remain under observation for the next 48 hours, Dr. Cole continued, glancing briefly at her watch, a simple, functional piece that stood in silent judgment of Cassandra's diamonds. "The nursing staff will update you on his room assignment shortly." Cassandra took a step forward, her voice trembling. "Dr. Cole, I don't know what to say. I had no idea who you were. I was so stressed about Kenneth, and I—" Dr. Cole held up a single hand, stopping the apology before it could fully form. Her expression remained quietly controlled, her lips gently closed. She didn't need the apology, and she certainly didn't seem to want it. "You don't need to explain, Mrs. Hale," Dr. Cole said softly. "My job was to save your son. That has been done. Who I am outside of that operating room shouldn't have mattered for you to treat me like a human being. But Kenneth is a strong boy. He deserves the future we just gave back to him." With a final courteous nod, Dr. Cole turned to walk toward the staff lounge. She didn't look back. She left Cassandra standing in the middle of the corridor, clutching a discarded piece of plastic and realizing that while she had her son back, she had lost something else, the right to believe she was a better woman in the room. The Whitmore standard had been dismantled not by an insult, but by a grace she wasn't yet capable of understanding. The hospital corridor felt longer and colder than it had just an hour before. Cassandra stood near the entrance of the staff break room, her fingers trembling as she clutched her designer leather handbag. Inside was a small, rectangular slip of paper that she viewed as her salvation, a personal check with enough zeros to fund an entire floor of the hospital for a woman raised on the Whitmore standard. There was no mistake so grave that it couldn't be smoothed over with a significant financial gesture. This was how her world functioned. Guilt was merely a debt to be settled, and she was prepared to pay in full. When the door opened, Dr. Cole stepped out, having changed back into her modest beige shirt and dark trousers. The sight of her in those plain clothes, looking once again like the woman Cassandra had dismissed on the floor, sent a fresh jolt of shame through Cassandra's chest. But she suppressed it, falling back on the only language she knew, the language of the transaction. "Dr. Cole," Cassandra began, stepping forward with practiced, socialite poise that felt brittle in the sterile light. "I've spent the last hour thinking about what happened, about Kenneth, about everything." She reached into her bag and pulled out the check, holding it between two manicured fingers. "I know an apology is just words. I want to do something meaningful. This is a donation to your personal research fund. No strings attached. It's the least I can do for the woman who saved my son's life." She held the paper out, her eyes searching Zorene's face with a flicker of excitement or gratitude she was used to seeing when she opened her checkbook. She expected the power dynamic to stabilize, for the world to return to its familiar axis where she was a benefactor and the other was a recipient. Dr. Cole didn't reach for the paper. She didn't even look at the numbers written on it. She stood with her hand resting loosely on her leg, her expression unreadable. The quiet humiliation that had defined her posture on the floor was gone, replaced by a dignity that made Cassandra's millions look like pocket change. "Mrs. Hale," Zareen said, her voice soft but carrying a weight that the check could never match. "You're trying to buy your way out of feeling. You think that if I take this money, the memory of you pouring that water onto the floor disappears. You think it makes us even." Cassandra's hand faltered, the check fluttering slightly in the draft of the hallway. I want to show my appreciation. I want to make things right." "You can't make this right with a signature," Dr. Cole replied, her gaze steady and unervingly calm. She looked at the check, then back at Cassandra's face. "I didn't save Kenneth for a research grant. I save him because it is my duty to preserve life, regardless of whose life it is. Your money can buy the best equipment in this building, but it cannot buy the respect you refuse to give a thirsty stranger. Keep your check, Mrs. Hale. Use it to teach your son that people have value even when they have nothing to offer you." Without a backward glance, Zareen walked away toward the exit, her modest, practical clothing disappearing into the crowd of the lobby. Cassandra was left standing alone, holding a piece of paper that had never felt more worthless. The Whitmore standard had finally failed her, leaving her with fortune in her hand and a profound poverty in her soul. The hallway felt cavernous, the air suddenly too thin for Cassandra to breathe. She stood frozen, the check, a slip of paper that represented a small fortune, still extended in her hand like a flag of surrender that no one was willing to accept. For the first time in her life, the Whitmore standard had met a wall it could not scale. She watched Dr. Cole's retreating back, the simple beige shirt moving with a steady, unhurried grace that made Cassandra's silk and diamonds feel like a costume. "Wait!" Cassandra called out, her voice cracking, stripped of its usual melodic authority. Dr. Cole stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She simply stood with her shoulders squared, a silhouette of quiet strength against the clinical light of the exit. When she finally turned, her expression was not one of victory, but a profound, weary clarity. Her eyes, which had navigated the microscopic vessels of a child's brain for hours, now seemed to look straight through Cassandra's curated exterior. "You think this is about the water," Cassandra whispered, her eyes stinging. "You think I'm just a monster who enjoys being cruel. I was terrified. I was losing my son, and I didn't see you." "That is exactly the point, Mrs. Hale," Zareen replied, her voice low and resonant. "You didn't see a person. You saw a category. You saw a heavy woman on a floor and decided she was beneath the basic dignity of a drink of water. If I had been wearing this lab coat, then you would have handed me the bottle yourself. But character isn't how we treat the powerful. It's how we treat the exhausted." Cassandra looked down at the check again. It felt heavy now, a leaden weight of evidence. "Please, if you won't take it for yourself, take it for the hospital. Let me do something to prove I'm grateful." Zareen took a slow step back toward her, not to take the money, but to ensure her next words were etched into Cassandra's memory. "I performed that surgery with the same precision I would have used if you had been the kindest woman I'd ever met. I didn't save Kenneth because of your status, and I didn't save him despite your cruelty. I saved him because I am a doctor. I saved him because of who I am, not because of who you are." She looked at the check one last time, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, one that carried more pity than 1,000 insults. "Keep your money, Cassandra. Use it to buy your son a world where he doesn't have to look at a woman like me to know he should be kind to her. That would be the only donation I'd ever value." Dr. Cole turned and walked through the sliding glass doors, disappearing into the warm, cinematic light of the afternoon. Cassandra remained in the corridor, the silence rushing back in to fill the space. She looked at the spot on the floor where the water had once been, now perfectly clean, and then at the empty plastic cup she still clutched in her other hand. Kenneth was safe, but as she folded the worthless check and tucked it away, she realized the surgery had fixed more than just her son's heart. It had finally broken hers. For the first time, the Whitmore standard was gone, replaced by the heavy, sobering weight of a grace she hadn't earned, but would spend the rest of her life trying to deserve. 6 months later, the high-gloss marble of the Whitmore estate felt different under Cassandra's feet. Less like a pedestal and more like a floor. She stood in the center of her son's playroom, watching Kenneth build a sprawling, chaotic city of wooden blocks. He was healthy, vibrant, and possessed a coordination that the surgeons had once called a miracle, but which Cassandra now knew was a result of a tired woman sitting on a hospital floor, refusing to let exhaustion beat her. On the mahogany side table sat a framed photograph. It wasn't a portrait of a Whitmore ancestor or a snapshot of a gala. It was a candid photo of Kenneth and a group of children at the new Amati Cole Community Clinic. Cassandra had spent the last half year redirecting the Whitmore Standard. The funds she once used to isolate herself were now flowing into the neighborhoods she used to drive through with her windows rolled up. She hadn't sent another check to Dr. Cole. Instead, she had shown up at the clinic's instruction site in a plain shirt, asking where the workers needed water. She had learned that true status isn't found in the height of a skyscraper or the clarity of a diamond, but in the breadth of one's peripheral vision, the ability to see the person in the shadows, the worker in the hallway, and the stranger in distress. Kenneth looked up from his blocks, holding out a small wooden person. "Mom, where does this one go?" Cassandra knelt on the floor, ignoring the slight pull of her expensive fabric against the carpet. She looked at the small figure, then back at her son. "He goes wherever someone needs help, Kenneth," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that had been missing for 40 years. "Because everyone we meet is carrying a world we can't see. And sometimes the most important thing you can offer someone isn't a crown, but a cup of water." As she sat there on the floor with her son, Cassandra realized that Dr. Cole's surgery hadn't just saved Kenneth's life. It had dismantled the walls of glass cage she hadn't known she lived in. The moral lesson was etched into her daily life. Wealth can pay for the best of everything, but only humility can make you worthy of it. Kindness, she now understood, was the only currency that never lost its value. And for the first time in her life, Cassandra Whitmore Hale felt truly rich.